Afghanistan is
Yep.
going through a tragic state of affairs, and the international parties who used to be major stakeholders since decades are now on a run, leaving behind the people of Afghan, women and children in hands of the terror groups masquerading as saviors. Hello and welcome to Uncut. I'm Aruti Verma, and today we are here to discuss Afghanistan's fallout, the bigger picture. We have with us today William Dalrymple, who just taught me how to pronounce his name right. He is a renowned historian and author of award-winning books like The Anarchy, Return of a King, Battle for Afghanistan, The Last Mughal, Nine Lives, among numerous others. His love for travel, history, and culture can be discerned through his 10 published books, all of which have won literary awards. The long list of honors and accolades that Mr. Dalrymple has received includes the Thomas Cook Travel Book Award, Dove Cooper Memorial Prize, the Hemingway, the Sunday Times Young British Writer of the Year, and more. Apart from being awarded the President's Medal for British Academy, he's also a regular contributor to the New York Times, the Guardian, and the New York. It's an honor to have you with us today, William.
Thank you, Rudy. Have I pronounced your name correctly?
Absolutely right. So today's discussion is about Afghanistan's fallout, the bigger picture, and the agenda of discussion is to have a dialogue on the sorry state of affairs that unfolded in Afghanistan after withdrawal of US troops, US term in Afghanistan and its shortcomings, Taliban's future and complex nature of nation's people and history, and the human rights catastrophe in the region. So, William, what happened in Afghanistan, despite the 20 years of time frame that the world superpower had in hands, is absolute institutional collapse of democratic efforts, if I may call it. Was it avoidable, and did it really have to come down to this? What do you think?
Well, I think it was always going to be a long shot because Afghans do not like to have governments imposed on them from outside. And there were many who perceived the administration, which has just fled, as being just that, an American puppet. Whether that view is right or wrong, it was widely perceived as such in Afghanistan. And I think quite neutral observers have expressed very deep reservations about the validity of the elections which took place, particularly the last one where Ashraf Ghani came out. There are many who believe that in fact Ghani came third in that election, and that it was energetic ballot rigging which won him his job. So it's not entirely it's not an entirely ridiculous position to see this as in the rural hinterland. There were many who did so, which gave the Taliban more popularity than we would like to believe. It's certainly true that the Taliban were armed, sheltered, formed, guided, and funded by Pakistan's ISI. But it's also true, and it's something that we don't really like to admit, but it's unquestionably the case, that they had a lot of backing from certain constituencies within Afghanistan. And those constituencies were particularly the rural poor, the conservative, uneducated rural masses, and there's also a tribal element in all this. The Karzai is the head of the Popalzai tribe, which is rather like it's the descendants of Ahmed Shah Durrani, who are, if you like, what the Mughals were to India, except that they're indigenous, that they were from that region. The Taliban are made up of the foot soldiers of the Taliban are very largely the Ghilzai tribe, who are the rural nomads and the dispossessed. So beneath what seems sometimes, particularly if you're looking from India or looking from Britain, a very straightforward clash between Democrats who are pro-women, pro-university educations, looking to the West, looking forward, and the barbarous medieval Islamist horde funded by Pakistan. Behind that very simple division lies an ancient tribal fault line between the Baraksai on one side and the Ghilzai on the other. Beyond that, also there is a north-south thing going on, because this government was formed largely out of the Northern Alliance, and certainly in the early days after 9/11 and after Karzai was put in, a lot of its office holders, perhaps the the greatest power in Kabul was given to the former Northern Alliance, who are Uzbek and Tajik, while the opposition, the Taliban, were pushed. So it's very important to understand that as in many countries, as in India, as in Pakistan, things are not always as simple as they seem, and that there are ancient divisions and complexities which lie beneath the obvious fault lines, which one sees in short news flashes.
So as you just mentioned that there have been different parties at play, right? And it's not as simple as it appears from the outside. There have been mixed, I would say, the group among Afghanistan itself. There have been people who have been, I would say, favoring the traditional ways of Islamic culture, and others who were bothered about the interference of outside parties. This brings me to my next question.
A third factor, I think, is that the current dispensation, which has just ended, the administration of Karzai and Ghani, were also seen very much as corrupt.
Right.
They were, I think, accurately often perceived as having their hands at the till, running off with vast quantities of aid money, and stories that Ghani arrived at the airport with a car stuffed with cash and wasn't able to fit all of it in the plane and was leaving cash on the runway and this sort of thing. Right. These stories I've heard from several places. They're not confirmed, but they're not unlikely either, and they're widely believed.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So rather like with Iran in the 1970s, what seems like a sort of straightforward Islamist movement actually shelters wider social fissures, and the dispossessed, those who weren't getting access to large quantities of foreign cash, felt that the people in power were greedy, corrupt, feathering their own nests, and many of those people, certainly the Taliban, like to spin it that they are the sword of justice, that they are bringing these effete, corrupt, foreign-funded people to justice and establishing a patriotic regime. That's the spin of the Taliban, and there's enough truth in it for some people to believe it, and in the rural hinterland for many people to sympathize certainly with that.
And is this also the reason? Is this also the reason why exactly the U.S. mission in Afghanistan failed? Because President Biden might be addressing in his speech that U.S. has succeeded in all the mission in Afghanistan, but the truth is it didn't. It wasn't able to free Afghanistan as being used as a terror base by the Afghanistan, I would say, Taliban and Al-Qaeda, right? So is it the misadventure of the US, or is it the complex history and nature of Afghanistan's people and its history that has led to this?
This project of planting liberal democracy in a country having just defeated the previous regime in war, which is what happened in 2001, was always going to be hard. Afghanistan, as we know, reacts very violently to foreign invaders. They got rid of the British, they got rid of the Russians, and now they've got rid of this American-backed regime. So it was always going to be a difficult one. But it wasn't impossible that it would be pulled off. There were an awful lot of people in Afghanistan that wanted development, that wanted democracy. The women wanted to go to work. They wanted to go to university, particularly in the cities. So it was going to be a hard struggle, but it was possible. And you had a certain amount of success, I think, with Hamid Karzai. Karzai was a very popular leader, as well as obviously being a very pro-Indian leader. And he went to school in college in Simla. He speaks Hindi. He likes Hindi film songs. He watches Bollywood. But he's also a man greatly respected at home. And he had both the charm and the attitude that a government should be a big tent. He always said he wanted the Taliban to come in and join the government. He didn't want to have them defeated and crushed in war. He wanted them to be part of his government and to represent their constituency democratically. Unfortunately, his successor, Ashraf Ghani, was far less open-tented in his policy. He was a very clever man, a brilliant academic who worked at the World Bank and taught at Columbia University, wrote brilliant papers on anthropology, but was short-tempered. Tribal leaders that had walked across the country to come and see him were given 10 minutes only, and then told to go off to where they come from. And he simply lacked charm and the ability to charm people into joining him. And that was reflected in the way that, frankly, no one was prepared to die for his regime. We, in a sense, what we would love to have been true was that this was a brave last stand of democracy and freedom, and that everyone lined the trenches fighting for it. But what we saw last week was not that. That all the government troops melted away, governors handed over their palaces to the Taliban commanders, and some people in Kabul, for whatever reasons, appeared to welcome the Taliban. And we've seen those pictures on television of people offering them flowers and roses and so on. Obviously, trying to pacify them on one hand, but also, it's not black and white. There are those who welcome what has happened, whether we like it or not.
Absolutely.
So I don't know. I don't think it was impossible. I think it could have been done, and with the right leadership, without corruption, with money flowing more freely through society, with the dispossessed being brought into the tent, with distant tribal groups and minor tribes, and the underdogs, the nomads, and the sharecroppers and the day laborers benefiting from this. It could have been done, but it wasn't. And Ghani got increasingly unpopular and isolated, and in the end, no one was prepared to die for him. And we are now where we are, and that, in a sense, is the big question: where are we? What does this version of the Taliban actually mean? And it's too early to say. The negative sides are very clear. There was revenge killings in Mazar-e-Sharif and in Kandahar. Women have been stopped going to university in Herat and stopping going to work in Herat. There have been some bloody atrocities as part of this campaign. The more optimistic signs that over the last few days is, for example, Tolo, the equivalent of NDTV in Kabul, the big liberal news network, which was set up by a man called Saad Musni, who I actually had to dinner last night here in London. Tolo has continued broadcasting, despite having for 20 years opposed the Taliban in every news broadcast. They have been allowed to continue, and yesterday, Saad authorized his women presenters to go back on there wearing headscarves but not burqas, and they interviewed a Taliban commander. Now, this is something that would never have happened in the last round. There have been no mass killings yet in Kabul. Not only is Abdullah and Hamid Karzai still in Kabul with their families and still alive, they haven't been thrown in jail, and they're negotiating with the Taliban to form a unity government. So all these are good signs. I mean, it would be quite impossible to imagine that the TV networks were closed down by now, that there were massacres, that Karzai and Abdullah were strung up on lampposts like the last president was when the Mujahideen came in. And
so, like you said, like you just mentioned, that there hasn't been any mass killings in the Kabul, right? And they're on a brighter side, if you look at it, the situation is relatively not that bad. But at the same time, it might be I would say, propaganda of the Taliban. Do you think it is trying to win the validation from Western governments as of now to be accepted as a legitimate government in Afghanistan? Or is it something that we can continue seeing in the time to come?
We just don't know yet. Certainly, they have good reason, obviously, to want to have the world accept them and not oppose them. Most obviously, in the terms of the central bank. Now, the central bank, I understand, has been frozen by America, and the Taliban are not able to access the many trillions of dollars sitting in those bank books. Now, yes, you're right. So that there is a clear and obvious motive for the Taliban to make positive liberal noises at this stage, while maybe having more hardline ideas lined up for the future. That's completely a possibility. Nonetheless, if you told anyone a week ago that the Taliban had A, would have been able to take Kabul, and B, that they took it bloodlessly, and C, that they allowed television stations to continue working and allegedly also allowed women to continue in their jobs in Kabul, no one would have believed it. So, all one can do at this stage is look at the evidence and wait and see how it pans out. The best case scenario is we could end up with something like Saudi Arabia, which, serious human rights abuses, restrictions on women, and many other drawbacks, as the killing of Khashoggi showed. But nonetheless, a state that acts like a state is accepted in the world, and plays its part in the family of nations. It's not impossible that we'll see that. It's still, I would say, it's a long shot, but we can only hope. As I say, I haven't been in Kabul this week, and I can't claim to have had first-hand evidence of what's happened. But I had to dinner last night the man who owns the largest TV network, and I talked with him until 2 a.m. He's been in touch with Karzai, with Ashraf Ghani, with Abdullah. And I think everyone is, I wouldn't say cautiously optimistic, but the signs are a lot better than they were on Sunday night.
Right. Okay, so talking about women's rights, so we're just talking about what the condition of women in Taliban is, and it might turn out to be good. They might allow the women to join the government forces and government services in the Kabul. They might not. It's about, we have to wait to see that what happens. But women's rights, even the fundamental, most basic women's rights in Afghanistan are already crumbled down to the ground, right? With Taliban's takeover, there might be statements like they can join the government forces, but at the same time, they are painting the walls and banners that are, displaying women. It's tragic. It's a big blow to humanity. But the truth is that the nation has been taken back in centuries, I would say. So do you think that the heartbreaking and extremely difficult situation of women's rights in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan will impact women empowerment state in other Islamic nations too? Will the evil follow to the other nations, to the other land with similar ideological roots?
Well, no, I don't think that's the case. I don't think this will, suddenly make Saudi Arabia stop women driving there. Right. That's something that MBS has famously allowed now for the first time. I don't think we're going to see a domino effect like that. And in fact, what you're seeing is the opposite. I mean, I had at the same dinner last night some Iranians who've been watching Iranian state television, following how they've been reporting it, and they're all portraying themselves now as very much the moderates with these terrible fundamentalists who've come to power in Kabul. And so what you might find actually is the opposite. You might find people trying to distance themselves from the Taliban. What I think, though, unquestionably is a massive negative blow is this has been a huge prestige boost for extreme Islamist groups. ISIS and so on have been on the run since the loss of their safe areas in eastern Syria and in Iraq. The war against Al Qaeda had almost disappeared from view over the last few months, and they will now be unburdened. I have no doubt at all that this will be seen by extremist groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda and so on, Boko Haram, as a major victory, and that I think is a very, very great worry. Also, of course, the possibility that two possibilities: one, that Afghanistan will again become a sheltering ground for Al Qaeda, which is already happening. They're already there, so that's not unreasonable to assume will continue. And secondly, that these American weapon systems that are being captured this week will be used by these groups. I don't think it sounds like there's not nuclear weapons, or I don't believe there are large numbers of advanced fighter jets or anything which have suddenly fallen into Taliban hands. But and I know that the head of the Air Force managed to get out, I think, 30 helicopters to Uzbekistan yesterday.
In any way, like Pakistan and China's involvement in the matter and their, I would say, validation to Taliban as the rightful legitimate leader of Afghanistan says a lot about what they are planning to do, how much it still has ties with Al Qaeda. So moving to the next question, talking about
examine that, one second, there are two different things you just put there. So China and Pakistan are obviously different situations, and we should look at them both individually.
All right.
China, as we all know, is very clever in its approach to other nations. It sees the battle primarily in economic terms.
Absolutely.
And as far as Afghanistan is concerned, they see it as the place where they can get access to various rare earths needed for their computer screens and so on. The same is true of Tibet, incidentally. And they also, there's the world's largest copper deposit is in Mezainak in Logar province. So China, I think, has clearly put out an olive branch to the Taliban to keep economic ties going, while they are equally very fearful of and strongly opposed to anything that's likely to encourage Uyghur separatist groups in Western China.
Right.
Pakistan, Pakistan is a different story. As we all know, the Taliban has been based in Quetta. It has been funded by the ISI. It's been assisted by the ISI. There's absolutely no secret about this. It's been done for 10, close to 20 years now. Pakistan will be triumphant at what has happened. However, the Taliban are not the puppets of the ISI. They are autonomous, not just autonomous, they are a collection of autonomous individuals with their own aims and their own interests. And now that they're in power, the ISI will lose a lot of their leverage with the Taliban.
Right.
They don't have to do what they were told. I mean, they had to, to a certain point, they had to do what they were told when they were in Quetta as the guests of Pakistan. Now, to a certain extent, they don't have to do. And where their interests diverge from Pakistan, they will follow their interests. And so when I hear Indian commentators saying there is no difference between Pakistan and the Taliban, I do not agree that is the case. I think it's very different. I think the Taliban see themselves as Afghan nationalists. They're following what they believe to be the best path for Pakistan. And I have almost never heard an Afghan speak well of Pakistan, whatever their political affiliation. The Pakistanis are as disliked by Afghans as they are by Indians. There are individual friendships.
But do you think like Pakistan and Al-Qaeda speaking highly of Taliban and rejoicing the dominance of Taliban on Afghanistan says a lot about their relation?
Well, we know that before 9/11, the previous Taliban administration sheltered Al-Qaeda. We know for sure, according to intelligence reports, that Al-Qaeda continued to operate alongside the Taliban within Afghanistan. What we don't know now is the extent to which the Taliban will be prepared to jettison their friends in return for acceptance and international recognition. I mean, if the Taliban choose to openly embrace Al-Qaeda and to welcome them as publicly and openly as they did last time, there will be no access given to the central bank funds. They will have no diplomatic relations. India, for example, won't touch them with a barge pole, other than secret back channels. So I suspect there'll be some sort of fudge that, what Al-Qaeda there is will be disguised, kept in the background, and talked away by their increasingly fluent PR people in Doha and who will now be operating out of Kabul. So it's a complex situation. It's not black and white, and I do not know what is going to happen, and nor does anyone else. Today, for example, Karzai has been in discussion with the Taliban. There's been a press release that Karzai met with the Taliban leaders today. Now, that would seem to indicate some sort of version of a big government and an attempt to widen the government beyond into some sort of national unity government rather than a narrow Taliban one. Whether that happens, it remains to be seen. Whether it means anything also remains to be seen. But what has definitely not happened is that Karzai is not being strung up from a lamppost.
Right.
And that's encouraging.
Absolutely. So speaking of China, we were just discussing I would say, interest of China in this matter. So China has a considerable economic and I would say diplomatic influence on a lot of nations around the world, right? It has implemented its debt trap policy, and through which it has been able to gain some momentum in, I would say, diplomatic supremacy in the world. And it has agreed to negotiate and create diplomatic ties with Taliban, right? So do you think that this move of China will motivate, or I would say help Taliban to validate, basically be accepted by the Western governments and the governments of other nations as a legitimate Afghanistan, I would say, government? Will China have a role to play in this matter?
So, as I understand it, and others may differ from me in this, the process of legitimizing the Taliban began, bizarrely enough, with the Trump administration. and the Doha Agreement.
Right.
As soon as the Americans had recognized the Taliban embassy in Doha, allowed the flag to be raised, and then entered negotiations, and then under the envoy Khalizad, who negotiated this very dodgy Doha agreement, which opened the gates for everything that's followed. From that moment, America pressurized the Afghan government to start releasing 500, I think it was, of the Taliban commanders held in captivity and in prison. This was the point at which Russia, China, but also India began to have discussions with the Taliban, initially with the back channels, but then often more publicly. And so once America had granted a measure of legitimacy to the Taliban, everything else followed. And I think the Chinese would argue that once America had done a deal with them, what was stopping the Chinese doing? And Doha, I think, is the beginning of the end of that regime. As soon as you began negotiating with the Taliban and releasing their prisoners, everything else collapsed.
Absolutely. So talking of the international forces, so the most powerful Western nations stationed their troops across the country, the Afghanistan. There was always a significant international interest in the land that is not only exceptionally rich in mineral resources, but is also most strategically located, in terms of access to South Asia and Europe. Is it right to call the matter of Afghanistan a civil war, as President Biden mentioned in his speech? And especially by the leadership of Washington. I don't think it's a matter of civil war. What do you think?
No, I do think there were elements of civil war, definitely in the Taliban versus government conflict. You had large quantities of the Ghilzai and the southern Pashtun tribes supporting the Taliban. It wasn't. I mean, it would have been a very easy situation if it had just been a Pakistani quisling put in power by the ISI, staffed partly by Pakistani Pashtuns, and so on. But that clearly isn't the case. These people do have support, and we may regret that, and we may regard that as our failure, that there were those who supported it. But it is the case, and we've seen it very graphically on our screens over the last week.
But in most cases, all these internal paths, like you're talking about Pashtun and other different, I would say the primitive communities of Afghanistan, they have been gaining, I would say, support and funding from the outside powers, the Western powers. So in that term,
the funding is, yeah. The question was, is it a civil war? Yes. And yeah, to a certain extent, you have one set of tribes following the Taliban route, funded, assisted, given shelter by Pakistan, but staffed largely by Afghans, and the other a rival group based on the Northern Alliance, but with Pashtun supporters largely from the Popalzai and Barakzai tribes, Ahmadzai tribes, which were supported by America and the West, and obviously by India. So yes, it's not unreasonable to see it as a civil war. I would accept that characterization. Particular sort of civil war, but, and funded from outside, certainly. But most civil wars are. If you look at the Spanish Civil War, obviously Stalin was supporting one side and Hitler was supporting the other. That's in the nature of civil wars. It didn't stop it being a Spanish Civil War because there were international fighters fighting and there were international funders. So international funders funding.
Right. Okay, so the last question that I have is, so technically speaking, America's military engagement have historically proved to be very perplexing, I would say. Whether it's Iraq, Syria, or Afghanistan, its allies always are left behind, militarily weak. Its adversaries, in most cases, the terror groups, at the end of the wars, they stand adapted and even stronger. And the political institutions are always disparaged once they leave, being hijacked as soon as the US keeps its first foot out of the troubled land. And still, Washington claims to have won the wars it has fought, the latest example being President Biden, of course. So what does the term success in war exactly means in the dictionary of the US leadership? Every time they are like, we have won the war, but there's a lot of cost that the people of that native land has to bear. So what is the definition of success in a war?
Well, I think it's pure wishful thinking on behalf of Biden if he thinks he's won this war. The same government, the Taliban, who were in charge before 9/11, are now in charge again. I can't see any way that he can claim a victory in this war. It's clearly a defeat, and that's clearly for domestic political consumption. You're right. There have been some very bad American defeats over the last 50 years. Obviously, Vietnam. But Syria was hardly a great success. Iraq was hardly a great success. In all these conflicts, America has played a very problematic role. And you're right. I think along with the encouragement given to Islamist groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda, the worst fallout from this, diplomatically speaking, is going to be the degree to which no one will trust NATO and the West to support them. Who would believe American assurances of support after this? It's a very damaging moment for the West, I think, and in the same breath, it is by default a very good moment for China. And America is made to look extremely foolish, and all the more so when it claims victory in what was clearly a bitter and a comprehensive defeat.
Absolutely, absolutely. It has been like I would say the biggest mobilizer and motivator of the changing world order. The US might be having intentions that were not supposed to be sinister in its missions in the Afghanistan land, but yeah, it turned out to be a failure. At the same time, the missions of China, maybe direct or indirect or whatever it was, they turned out to be right. So in a way, we can say that there's a changing world order which has been seen in its light of dawn, I would say, through this Afghanistan war's end. And we really hope that it's everything that is going wrong in Afghanistan land right now, the human right violation and all the sufferings that people are going through right now. It all just falls into place one day or the other, and the parties that are involved in this matter, they take the responsibility of their actions, and it all comes down to something good in the future. Thank you so much for being with us today, William. It was really an honor to have you here.
Rudy, but I fear darker days lie ahead, but I hope you're right.
Yeah, we hope, absolutely. Hope is all we have as humanity.
Thank you, Rudy.
Thank you so much for joining us today.